The Grand Hall of the Silver Pines Country Club was adorned in gold and navy, a fitting tribute to James Wainwright's illustrious 40-year career at the helm of Wainwright Industries. Guests mingled, glasses of champagne in hand, as a live jazz quartet filled the air with smooth melodies. Among them was Margaret Wainwright, James's devoted wife of 35 years, her elegance commanding attention in a midnight blue gown that shimmered under the crystal chandeliers. James, always the charmer, basked in the adoration of his colleagues and friends. Yet Margaret noticed his gaze linger on someone across the room. Denise Holloway, his secretary for the past 2 decades. Denise, 10 years younger and radiating effortless grace, returned his glance with an all-too-familiar smile. Margaret had suspected for years, but never had the proof or the courage to confront her suspicions. Tonight, however, she had both. As dessert was being served, Margaret stood. She held her glass high, signaling the beginning of her toast. The room quieted, all eyes turning to the poised matriarch. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret began, her voice steady yet laced with an undercurrent of tension. "Tonight, we celebrate not just James's retirement, but his decades of dedication, integrity, and loyalty. Or so it seems." A ripple of unease swept through the room. James's confident smile faltered. Margaret continued, her gaze now fixed on her husband. "James has always been a man of ambition. He built this company from the ground up, working tirelessly to provide for his family. For that, I am grateful. But ambition, my friends, often comes with a price." James shifted uncomfortably in his chair, a sheen of sweat glistening on his brow. Denise, seated at a distant table, froze mid-sip of her wine. "You see," Margaret said, her tone sharpening, "for the past 20 years, James's dedication extended beyond this company and his family. It extended to her." She pointed directly at Denise. Gasps echoed through the hall, followed by an oppressive silence. James rose from his chair, his face pale. "Margaret, this isn't the time." "Oh, it is precisely the time," Margaret cut him off, her voice now trembling with controlled fury. "For 2 decades, I've played the dutiful wife, raising our children, hosting your parties, supporting your career, and all the while, you carried on with her under my nose." Denise set her glass down with a trembling hand, the room's attention now fully on her. Someone coughed nervously. Others whispered, their curiosity overtaking decorum. Margaret reached into her clutch, pulling out a stack of photographs. She flung them onto the table, where they spilled like damning confetti. "I found these in your office, James. Romantic weekends, gifts, trips to Paris. Do you remember those, Denise?" Denise didn't respond, her face flushed with embarrassment. James's shoulders slumped as he stammered, "I never meant to hurt you, Margaret. I can explain." "Explain?" Margaret snapped, her voice rising. "Explain how you betrayed your vows. Explain how you made a fool of me, of our family, of yourself." "No, James, I think we're past explanations." The room was a cauldron of emotions, shock, pity, morbid curiosity. The jazz quartet had long since ceased playing. Margaret turned to the stunned audience, raising her glass one final time. "To James Wainwright, a man who excelled in business but failed at the most important partnership of his life. Congratulations on your retirement, James. I hope it's as empty as the promises you made me." With that, she drained her champagne, set the glass on the table, and walked out of the hall, her heels echoing like gunshots against the marble floor. The room erupted into murmurs. James slumped into his chair, head in his hands, while Denise quietly gathered her things and slipped away, her exit as unnoticed as her arrival had been. Margaret stepped into the cool night air, the weight of decades finally lifting off her shoulders. For the first time in years, she felt free, not from James, but from the lies that had bound her to him. The party continued inside, but it was clear to everyone that the legacy of James Wainwright had been irreparably shattered, and Margaret, for all her pain, had emerged victorious. The fallout from Margaret's revelation rippled through the lives of everyone present at the party, and far beyond. The night at Silver Pines marked the beginning of the end for James Wainwright's carefully curated empire. The morning after, Margaret sat alone in her garden, the scent of jasmine mingling with the crisp autumn air. A cup of tea steamed in her hand, but she barely noticed. Her phone buzzed incessantly with messages, condolences from friends, curiosity from acquaintances, and even veiled disdain from some who believed she should have kept the matter private. She didn't care. For the first time in years, Margaret felt no obligation to maintain appearances. James, however, faced a very different morning. At his office downtown, the board of directors had called an emergency meeting. Though technically retired, the company was still deeply tied to his name, and the scandal had sent shareholders into a frenzy. The photographs Margaret had unveiled the night before had found their way online, no doubt leaked by one of the more enterprising guests. News outlets were already running stories on the Wainwright affair. "James," said Arthur Langston, the chairman of the board, his voice low and grave, "we need to distance the company from this mess. Effective immediately, we're revoking your emeritus status." James stared at Arthur, his face pale and drawn. "You can't do that. I built this company." Arthur leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "And now your personal life is tearing it down. Do the math, James. You're a liability." The humiliation was suffocating, but James could say nothing. He left the office he had built with his own hands, his legacy crumbling behind him. Denise Holloway tried to disappear. The photographs had implicated her as much as James, and she had become the target of online vitriol. Her neighbors whispered behind her back, and clients at her part-time interior design business suddenly found reasons to take their projects elsewhere. A week after the party, she received an unmarked envelope at her apartment. Inside were copies of the same photographs Margaret had shown the world, but these came with a note. "Did you think I wouldn't know? You're as guilty as he is. Watch your back." Denise's hands trembled as she read the words. Who had sent them? Margaret? Someone else at the party? Or perhaps someone she and James had hurt along the way? Meanwhile, Margaret began to take stock of her life. For decades, she had defined herself as James Wainwright's wife. Now, she had to rediscover who she was without him. She hired a divorce lawyer, one of the most ruthless in the city, and began the process of unraveling their shared assets. To her surprise, the more she dug into their finances, the more secrets she uncovered. Offshore accounts, hidden properties, lavish expenses disguised as business costs. Margaret realized that James's betrayal extended far beyond the affair. He had siphoned money into a shadowy world she never suspected existed. One evening, Margaret met with her lawyer, Eleanor Price, in a private office overlooking the city. "It's worse than I thought," Eleanor said, sliding a folder across the table. "Your husband has been embezzling company funds for years. This isn't just about a divorce, Margaret. If you want, we could take this to the authorities." Margaret stared at the documents, her anger hardening into determination. "Do it," she said. "Let him face the consequences of everything he's done." 2 months later, James Wainwright was arrested in his home. The charges included embezzlement, fraud, and tax evasion. The media frenzy reignited, and Margaret's name was once again thrust into the headlines, not as a victim, but as the woman who had taken down a titan. James pleaded for leniency, blaming his actions on the pressure of maintaining his empire and his affair on the loneliness of success. But neither the courts nor the public showed him sympathy. Margaret watched the trial unfold from a quiet corner of the courtroom, her face impassive. As the guilty verdict was read, she felt a strange mixture of vindication and sorrow. Months later, Margaret stood in the doorway of her newly purchased cottage by the sea. The divorce settlement had been generous, thanks to Eleanor's expertise. More importantly, Margaret had gained something far more valuable than money: freedom. She began volunteering at a local women's shelter, using her experience to counsel others who had endured betrayal and loss. In time, she became a pillar of her community, known not as the woman scorned, but as the woman who rose from the ashes. As for James, his story faded from the headlines, his name remembered only as a cautionary tale. And Denise? She left town, her whereabouts unknown, though whispers of her resurfaced in different cities, each story more mundane than the last. Margaret often thought of that night at Silver Pines, the night she took her life back. It had been painful, messy, and public, but it had also been necessary. And as she watched the waves crash against the shore, she knew she had finally found peace. It was a warm summer afternoon when Margaret received the letter. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar. She hesitated before opening it, uncertain if she had the energy for yet another twist in her story. The note inside was brief. "Margaret, I owe you an apology. You deserved better, and I failed you in every way. You were the best part of my life, and I was too blind to see it. I've decided to leave the country, to start over somewhere far away where no one knows me. I hope in time you can forgive me. James." Margaret stared at the letter, her emotions an indecipherable mix of relief and sadness. For decades, she had carried the weight of their marriage. Her love and loyalty met with deception. Now, at last, she was free, not just legally, but emotionally. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into a drawer next to the few photographs she had kept of their happier times. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step toward letting go. Over the following months, Margaret's life settled into a steady, fulfilling rhythm. The cottage by the sea had become her sanctuary. She spent her mornings walking along the shore, the salty breeze invigorating her spirit. Afternoons were dedicated to writing. Her memoir was taking shape, not as a tale of betrayal, but as a story of resilience and rediscovery. The women's shelter she supported had grown, thanks to her tireless advocacy and a generous donation from her divorce settlement. She saw herself in many of the women who came through its doors, strong yet fractured, searching for a way forward. One evening, after a particularly vibrant sunset, Margaret sat on her porch with a glass of wine. The sound of the waves calmed her, a gentle reminder of life's ceaseless ebb and flow. A visitor arrived, a local journalist who had been covering her story from the sidelines. He was writing an article about second acts in life and wanted to feature her. "You're a symbol of reinvention," he said, his admiration genuine. Margaret smiled, the kind of smile born from hard-won peace. "I'm just a woman who chose to live," she replied. Years passed, and Margaret's memoir, Shattered Vows, A Journey to Self, became a bestseller. Critics praised it as raw, unflinching, and empowering. Book tours took her across the country, where she met women and men who shared their own stories of heartbreak and healing. James's name was only a footnote in her narrative, a shadow that had once loomed large but now seemed insignificant. She refused to let him define her legacy. Instead, she crafted her own. One day, As she stood in a bookstore signing copies of her book, a young woman approached. "Your story saved me," the woman said, her voice trembling. "I left a toxic marriage because of you." Margaret took the woman's hand, her heart swelling with purpose. "You saved yourself," she said gently. The closing scene. On a bright spring morning, Margaret stood on the cliff overlooking the sea. She had chosen this place for her final home, a sprawling garden she had cultivated over the years, blooming around her. Birds sang in the distance, and the horizon stretched endlessly before her. She reflected on her journey, the love she had given, the pain she had endured, and the strength she had discovered. Life had broken her once, but she had rebuilt herself stronger than ever. As she watched the waves crash below, she whispered to the wind, "I am whole." And with that, Margaret turned and walked back to her cottage, the sun casting a golden light on the path ahead, a path she had carved with her own hands, a life truly her own.